thank you everyone for being here tonight. I know cold January night in Michigan is not the cheeriest thing in the world, but hopefully I'll interject some cheer into it. It smells like it's in the room here. It's nice to be christening it. First and foremost, I want to thank Father Mattson, Brian Fink, David Saddleman, and all the other people who have been putting together this series. It's really spectacular to see something of this intensity and of this interest happening more and more places, where the opportunity to explore the faith in new and interesting ways, bringing in people from all over to speak, very valuable. We've been doing that at Sacred Heart in Grand Rapids for a number of years, and it really has enlivened just the whole world there. So I'm really grateful and honored to be here for this event. Hopefully, in line with the name and focus of the Institute, hopefully I'll again shed more light than heat, even though, as we know, the intersection of faith and music can sometimes be a source of heat in various ways. Tonight, so often when someone speaks about church music, and especially when we say we're going to speak about the church teaching, often what happens is something that's highly prescriptive. Do this, don't do that. I'll do a little of that, but I'm more interested in really getting behind that and beginning to suggest ways that we can unite the theological and the procedural. Because if you really think about it, the liturgy as something that happens in real time with real people, in public, in a specified way, has to, at its heart, unite the theological and the procedural. And by procedural, I don't mean perfunctory, but I mean really how do we move forward together. And so I hopefully will suggest some ways that happens. Lurking behind a lot of what I'm talking about is also something that I think about and I talk about a lot with my students at all levels, which is, what is the nature of Catholic society? The society of Catholic. And so what I'll suggest is that we need to have a decent Catholic sociology, a theory or an idea of who we are as a community, moving forward together. And I'll cut to the chase, and I'll give you a little bit of the punchline. My best understanding and way of describing how Catholic society works is one that orders all things. It places all things in their proper relationship to Christ. It places all things in relationship to the good. And it has everything ordered so that it may be best animated by grace. And so that seems awfully high flying for a music lecture. We'll get down to some brass tacks too. So again, the idea of a Catholic sociology where all things are ordered toward the good, the true, the beautiful. I'm going to use three primary sources for some of the things I'm going to be talking about. And I will read you some things. And I think it's really important here that the church has very inspired and beautifully worked out statements about what music is, how it functions in the liturgy, and how we as Catholic Christians experience that. So often we think, well, the church doesn't really say anything specific about that. Well, the church does. It says some beautifully specific things. And so there'll be three sources that I'll look at. One is really the place where what you might call the theology of church music really reached one of the first times where a comprehensive notion of what the real meaning of music in church is, which is a document by St. Pius X, Pope Pius X, early in the 20th century. And it's a particular kind of document called a motu proprio, meaning I, the Pope, specifically wrote this letter to you. And in this case, it was written to bishops. So he really wanted it to be something that really was enacted, not just something that existed as an idea, but something that was enacted. And that's from 1903. 100 years later, our most recent sainted Pope, Pope John Paul II, wrote a letter specifically for the centenary of the 1903 letter. He called it a chirograph. If you've looked at the writings of Pope John Paul, you'll know that he wrote in more different forms than any other pope in history, more different categories of writings and utterances. And the chirograph is similar to the motu proprio. It literally means by my own hand, as if to say, I really meant this. My secretary didn't write this, I wrote it. And in fact, it's his only document that's called a chirograph. You can go home and throw that into conversation. But it's a wonderful document. And it always, when you find one pope acknowledging and building on the writings and of another, you know that you've got something very, very holy. And then, on a level of great specificity and a really wonderful document, and now this will show you that I do qualify as a liturgy and music wonk, because I think this is a beautiful document and I read it all the time and I love it. It's called the General Instruction of the Roman Missal. It's the rules of the road. It's in the front of the missal, and it tells you how to do it. It's the introduction, but it's not just an introduction of tiny little rules. It really puts in context why the missal exists and how it functions. And so it's actually a very dynamic document. Because remember, as a liturgical culture, Catholicism enacts its beliefs. They're not just ideas that we sort of quietly share. They're beliefs that we enact in public. And so, you also, if you really want to impress people, call it what we liturgy nerds call it. We call it by its acronym, the GIRM, G-I-R-M. So just throw that into conversation, and somebody will know that you really know what's going on. So if it's okay with you, I will call it the GIRM instead of the General Instruction, just because the General Instruction sounds vaguely military. Okay, so there's some principles that for me are very important when talking about how music and liturgy are wedded with each other. Because if you really think about that, music and liturgy are in fact wedded. They are not exactly the same thing, but in a sense, like marriage, they become one flesh. They retain their identity and they become one flesh. And so here are some principles. One is one that's stated in every document you read throughout the 20th century, from every pope, from every liturgy committee practically out of the Vatican. And it talks about liturgy and music as existing for the sanctification and edification of the faithful. Notice it puts sanctification first. Sanctification meaning that it actually changes us. Edification is something where we take information out. But sanctification means that we take, in a sense, a different person out ourselves. And that's quite important. And so I'll add to that then therefore the music, if it's really doing what it should be doing, it has to serve the same salvific purpose as the liturgy itself. It can't have another purpose. It can't have a cross purpose or an extra purpose. It has to have precisely the same purpose. That seems obvious, but I think we all know that we've been to Mass maybe at least once in our life where that wasn't happening. The final thing, which seems very flat-footed after those sort of grandiose little statements, is that we need to be singing the liturgical texts themselves. We actually need to be singing the texts created, edited, translated, printed, and published by the Church itself. That's more radical than we think. Okay, so what is our theology? Do we have a theology of church music? I've sort of hinted at the fact that Pope Pius X really begins to create the essence of a theology of church music, or kind of a procedural way of describing the essence of it. And you'll see on the little handout, Pope Pius is very, very clear. Authentic church music. Authentic is an important word. Authentic church music has several qualities, and it has to always have these qualities. And these qualities have a particular order and relationship to each other. One is that it has to have sanctity or holiness. And it needs to be very clearly holy. It needs to be very clearly about the purpose of holiness and the transmission of grace. So sanctity or holiness. The second one is somewhat unusual. He sometimes calls it beauty, but the real term he uses for this is not just simply beauty. He calls it goodness of form. So, in other words, the way it's put together the way that the music is put together in its real detail, its concrete, written on the page, sung in real life details, has to fit the very precise place in the liturgy where it's serving. And so he has the idea of goodness of form. He uses the Italian phrase bonità delle forma. So it's the beauty of form, or goodness of form. He says, if music, church music, liturgical music, has those two qualities, those come first, then together they give birth to the third and ultimate quality, which is universality. Now you can see, of course, that he's really defining then a type of music that is essentially Catholic, because the universality, of course, really circles around to who we claim we are as the church. But notice that he's put these in a very particular order. And again, I'll assert that that's a very Catholic sociology, that things don't just exist in a pile over there, and as long as you've got 3 out of 4, you're good. Or, well, I've got a few, you've got a few, okay, let's put them together. No, he's saying, no, put them together in a particular order. And in fact, that's an essential element of the way that the faith works, and that's an essential element of the way we exist as Catholics in the world. So, sanctity, goodness of form, producing universality. Pope Pius was very strong in his statements. He was specifically speaking, while he was speaking to the universal church, he had in mind what was happening in Italy at the time. If you went to church then, you would think that you were hearing the songs out of the music hall down the street. He called it the theater, and he used that as the umbrella term for everything that was bad in music. Because the truth be told, it was really the same music as the theater down the street. It was all about solo singing, kind of entertainment-oriented music. And so he was horrified by that. Because he knew, of course, that it had no sanctity, probably very little goodness of form. And anyone outside of Italy would have said it has, like, negative universality. So, but you say, well, we don't have theater music today in church. Well, but we need to think, what is our theater? What, in a sense, secular part of our lives do we insist on hauling into church with us musically? Because we need to translate from his labeling music as theater and what we need to be labeling and thinking about musically. So here's what he says. He says the purpose of music is to add greater efficacy to the text. And isn't that why we have music, sung music always? We're raising up the text to a higher level than simply saying it. So he says, greater efficacy to the text. This is done so that through the music, the faithful will be more easily inspired, better disposed to receive the benefits of the grace that comes from the celebration of the holy mysteries. So he's really talking about disposition. And isn't disposition, of course, our own ordering of our own hearts to the real essence of the liturgy? Not simply our ideas about the liturgy, but the liturgy. Here's the most crucial statement. And it's crucial because this statement keeps getting picked up by every major document through the rest of the 20th century. In the highest degree, these qualities, universality, sanctity, goodness of form, are found in Gregorian chant, the only song that the church, he says she, directly proposes to the faithful as her own. Only music the Catholic Church has ever published. There are Catholic-related publishers who publish other music, but the Church itself has never published anything. And it goes on to say, in its movement, inspiration, and mood, the more closely a church composition approaches the Gregorian form, the more sacred and liturgical it becomes. The more out of harmony it is with that supreme model, the less worthy it is of the temple. So we've been taught that. It's a fairly radical statement, given the complicated context of the world. He goes on to give an enormous amount of detail about how you should do all of this. Though that's the essential part of what he was really trying to tell the church. Here's how the general instruction. Here's directly from the germ. The main place should be given, all things being equal, to Gregorian chant, as being proper to the Roman liturgy. Other kinds of sacred music, in particular polyphony, choral music with more than one part singing, are in no way excluded, provided that they correspond to the spirit of the liturgical action and that they foster the participation of all the faithful. This is directly from, that statement is actually a paraphrase from the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy from the Second Vatican Council. So that was also part of, that's called Sacrosanctum Concilium if you know all your documents. The first one that Vatican II put out, the document on the liturgy was the first one. Since the faithful from different countries come together ever more frequently, it is desirable that they know how to sing together in at least some parts of the ordinary of the Mass in Latin, Kyrie Gloria, Sanctus, Agnus Dei, especially the profession of faith and the Lord's Prayer according to the simpler settings. So even here, the general instruction is very concerned, number one, that we have singing, that it be oriented toward what the authentic teaching of the church is, and that it be universal. There's a huge interest in universality again in the general instruction. It's funny because the general instruction is called general because it refers to the whole missal and it refers to the whole church, but it's full of specifics. Yes, I love play on words, sorry. Now, just a little sidelight here. It talks about participation, and participation is really the crucial element in all of this because participation is where we enter in to the liturgy. But participation, we often just assume that we know what that means. And usually, because we're Americans in the 21st century, it usually means that we're doing something, like physically doing something or physically saying something. as opposed to our interior disposition. And it's very interesting. In Sacrosanctum Concilium, the Vatican II document on the liturgy, it's translated as active participation. But the word in Latin that gets translated as active is actually actuoso, not activo. Now, actuoso still means active. The root is still activity. But as we know, that word has a very different connotation between activo, which is not the word used, and actuoso. Just something to hold on to. It won't change your life today, but just to know, Sacrosanctum Concilium is very concerned that people were really scared that they were seeing babies flying out of bathtubs. And so Sacrosanctum Concilium says, the musical tradition of the Universal Church is a treasure of inestimable value, greater even than that of any other art. The architects like that. The main reason for this preeminence is that as sacred melody united to words, it forms a necessary or integral part of the solemn liturgy. The second part is scary because it means that we're charged with something of the utmost value and the utmost importance. So again, now here's an example of how the germ gives us some choices. Because now, as you know, the liturgy since 1970 involves the ability to make choices and to arrange liturgies with options in ways that the liturgy previously didn't have. And so, but these options are specific. And I'll give you a hint, we don't follow them. Okay, here's an example. Here's what the germ says, and the germ is the rule. Remember, the germ is, when they say they throw the book at you, like, you know, like the cop arrests you, cop stops you and says, this is the stuff. At the entrance, the beginning of Mass, at the entrance of the sacred ministers at the altar, we have 4 options. And it says specifically, in the Diocese of the United States of America. This is the version from 2010. This is the version, the brand new version. The first option, it says, the antiphon from the Missal, or the antiphon with its psalm from the Graduale Romanum, as set to music there or in another setting. The Graduale Romanum is the big boy, big girl book of Gregorian chant. That's the real stuff. The beautiful, long, ornate melodies that are almost a millennia old now. That's the first option. And remember, this is not for the old Mass. This is for the new Mass. Second option, the antiphon or the psalm from the Graduale Simplex. Everyone knew that the Graduale Romanum is very ornate and very complicated music. And there's a book called the Graduale Simplex. Again, as its name would imply, a simpler, easier version, but still with the same sense of sanctity about it. Third option, a chant from another collection of psalms or antiphons, approved by the Conference of Bishops or the diocesan bishop. No one's approved any of those. There is no bishop who has any claim to sanctity who would ever put his neck out like that. I mean, can you imagine? That would be really scary. And finally, fourth, another liturgical chant. In Latin it says alius cantus optus, an appropriate chant. that is suited to the sacred action, the day, or the time of the year, similarly approved by the Conference of Bishops. Well, people basically just say, we're going to pick 4 and cross out the last sentence, part of the sentence. And that's what we're going to pick. So, should we always be picking 4? Go up the food chain a little bit. All right, so these again are some of the basics, how there are current liturgical rules of the road and the theology that was set in motion, or in a sense codified or beautifully explained to us at the beginning of the 20th century, how they really resonate with each other very closely. And that they are very irenic, beautifully written documents. Well, here's what Pope John Paul has to say in 2003. Here, of course, he's had over 30, almost 40 years of liturgical reform and of liturgical change. And so we know that he is thinking about that. We know that, in a sense, he is speaking to people who have experienced great upheaval, great renewal, great optimism, great dismay, all kinds of emotions. And so when he chooses things, you know he's chosen them carefully. So he says, first and foremost, the goal is to maintain and promote the decorum of the house of God. Really making sure that we know that the house of God is God's house. And he repeats, or he pulls from Pope Pius X, not just a statement from his motu proprio, his document, but he takes Pope Pius X's personal motto as Pope. Instaurare omnia in Christo, restore all things in Christ. And again, what we're talking about is restoring that order, the order of the parts of the world and the faith. So again, he's very concerned, just as I was speaking before, about the idea of the words being absolutely central. And so he says, so Pope John Paul says, since it interprets and expresses the deep meaning of the sacred text to which it is intimately linked, it must be able, quote, to add greater efficacy to the text, in order that through it the faithful may be better disposed for the reception of the fruits of grace belonging to the celebration of the holy mysteries. Isn't that beautiful? That is really beautiful, because this is a pastoral pope, really making sure that we know that our disposition is of utmost importance. He also goes on to say that there is a high premium placed on the need to, quote, purify worship from ugliness of style, from distasteful forms of expression, from uninspired musical texts, which are not worthy of the great act that is being celebrated. You don't go to the Biltmore House in Asheville and eat frozen pot pie. Hopefully, they won't be doing that in the White House either. So he's very so these are concerns of his that he places a very high point in his document. He goes on. Music destined for sacred rites must have holiness. Oh, we've heard that before. As its reference point, indeed, sacred music increases in holiness to the degree that it is intimately linked with the liturgical action. So it doesn't just sort of happen while the liturgical action is happening, but it's really entwined with it. Remember, I used the image of marriage, of one flesh. He goes on to say, He says that things that are from what he calls outside of the temple, he calls profanum, not all of that is fit to cross its threshold. So there are things that are not appropriate. That category exists. And he goes, my venerable predecessor, Paul VI, wisely said, commenting on a decree of the Council of Trent, he explained that, quote, if music, instrumental and vocal, does not possess at the same time that sense of prayer, dignity, and beauty, it precludes the entry into the sphere of the sacred and the religious. And he said, and Pope John Paul also says, today, moreover, the meaning of the category sacred music has been broadened to include repertoires that cannot be part of the celebration without violating the spirit and norms of the liturgy itself. He does not point out specific things. He doesn't say, well, you know, this horrible church over here, look at what they do, it's terrible. Instead, he wants to orient our hearts so that then we make the decisions that are rightly ordered. He also repeats Pope Pius X's contention about Gregorian chant. With regard to the composition of liturgical music, I make it my own general rule, meaning me, the chirograph writer, with my own hand. That Pope Pius X formulated in these words, the more closely a composition approaches in its movement and inspiration and savor the Gregorian melodic form, the more sacred and liturgical it becomes. So it becomes liturgical by its nature. It's not liturgical just because it sits in church. It becomes liturgical because of its nature. The more out of harmony it is with that supreme model, the less worthy it is. And he goes on, because he's smart. He knows that people are going to say, so we can't do anything new? No one can do something creative? And he goes on. It is not, of course, a question of imitating Gregorian chant, but rather of ensuring that new compositions are imbued with the same spirit that inspired and little by little came to shape it. So the background, the conditions which create one repertoire that's good, can create other repertoires that are good. Only an artist who is profoundly steeped in the sensus ecclesiae, the sense of the church, the understanding of the church, can attempt to perceive and express in melody the truth of the mystery that is celebrated in the liturgy. Please don't do music by people, living people, who openly say, I'm not Catholic and would never become Catholic because I hate Catholicism. Because unfortunately, we have composers who are performed in Catholic churches very frequently who are living and say, oh no, I would never become Catholic because I disagree with the faith of the church. So we need to be very grown up about that. How many sacred works have been composed through the century by people deeply imbued with this sense of mystery? So he's saying this is not extraordinarily rare. The faith of countless believers has been nourished by melodies flowing from the hearts of other believers. Wow, he really understands human beings. Either introduced into the liturgy or used as an aid to dignified worship. In song, faith is experienced as vibrant joy, love, confident expectation of the saving intervention of God. Please let me read that again. Well, I'm going to anyway. In song, faith is experienced as vibrant joy, love, and confident expectation of the saving intervention of God. That's stunning. And again, what he's trying to do is to orient us so that once oriented, the right thing flows. Okay, so why this emphasis on chant and polyphony? Are there some concrete things behind that? Because we've got the basic, the thrust that these are the central repertoires. And by polyphony, The popes specifically mean music that is similar to music by composers, say, as Palestrina, William Byrd. Composers whose music has both grandeur and sobriety. It's dignified but not grave. It is glorious but not showy. And so it's in a sense as if you've woven together multiple melodies that are not unlike chant to form harmonies. And so that's why they specifically refer to that. Here's some things to know. Chant serves the words. Chant doesn't do anything else but serve the words. Chant is also serves the words of the liturgy itself. The actual words proposed, printed, approved, given to us as embodying the faith to be prayed publicly. So chant serves the words. Chant serves words individually and narratively, meaning that each word, as you move along, is expressed. Chant, when a composer sat down to write chant, or actually they were probably originally improvised vocally. Chant wasn't written down for a very, very long time. The text came first, not a musical idea. You can't have the libretto, the guy who wrote the words and the guy who wrote the music over here. If you do, the guy who wrote the music has to come second. So again, narratively, each word as it happens. Now here's something interesting. The biggest difference between chant and most music that we listen to is what we might call beat. If you think about it, the vast majority of music that any of us, including me, listen to outside of chant has a regular sense of beat, be it slow or fast. It's one of the hallmarks of Western music. Do you know that human beings are the only creatures on earth who can keep a beat? Even very intelligent monkeys go. They can't do it. Apparently there's some toucans that can do it. But this beat is in fact something that the composer has decided in advance, and it's imposed on the words. It's not, in other words, chant is very self-effacing in that regard. So the relationship of what we call metrical music, music that moves along with a regular beat, its relationship to the words has to be more general. In other words, the whole piece to the whole text, or at least a chunk of the text to a chunk of the music, as opposed to the word-by-word relationship in chant. And what it does is it means that the expressivity of individual words has to be left to the performer. That's a little scary to me. Another thing to think about, the vast majority, literally almost all, the texts of the Mass are prose, not poetry. If you think they are perhaps poetic in nature, poetic in spirit, but they're not actually poetry with set line lengths and a metrical structure. The only exceptions in the Mass are the sequences. Victimae Paschali Laudis Christians to the Paschal Victim for Easter, Veni Sancti Spiritus for Easter, for Pentecost. Those are metrical poetry. Otherwise, all the texts of the Mass are prose. And so, unlike hymns, prose texts don't necessarily lend themselves always to setting to music with a very strict beat, or where the strict beat is a very crucial part of the music. Are there any hymns that are officially part of the Mass? No. Those are always number 4, alias cantus aptus, not really approved by anybody. Often great and worthy, and I'll show you why. And I'll show you why they're really good and why I think we should all know how to sing them. Finally, so those are some of the most important issues about why chant is what it is. Chant is also sober. It asks us to breathe deeply and listen carefully. Chant is the ultimate vegan free-range music. Think about it. Almost all the music that we hear in life, and in fact, almost all the voices that we hear in a space larger than our own living room, are always mediated by these. In fact, we almost don't hear acoustic voices and acoustic sounds as natural. We hear amplified sounds as natural. I can't listen to any pop music from the last 15 years because it's all auto-tuned. And it's hideous. Now, I like cheap pop music, so don't think that I'm sitting up here being a big snob. Every once in a while, if I'm really tired in the end of the night, I put on a medley of Air Supply or something like that. Some of you are like, what's that? What's that? What's Air Supply? You know what I know. Okay, so we've talked about some of these principles. If we think about the alios, if we think about the question of goodness of form, here's some examples of how Pope Pius X would have thought about that. First of all, in the different places in the liturgy, for instance, the entrance chants of a liturgy are actually very objective. They don't stretch out the words greatly, but they do emphasize a few words here and there greatly. And so in other words, they give you the words, it's almost as if they underline just a few. Because the entrance is when you say while you're there, where you ask God to open your heart in a particular way. And so the entrance chants have that essence to them. The chants between the readings are very interesting, though, because the proportion of notes to words is enormous. Words are extended out. The chant that was sort of the grandfather of the responsorial psalm is called the gradual or the graduale. It will often have words that extend on individually for 45 seconds. And 45 seconds is a long time for a word, because of course what this music is our chants in between the readings to meditate. It's liturgical, aural, through your ear, A-U-R-A-L, Lectio Divina. And your goal there is very much not just to get through the words. In fact, your goal there is to enter as deeply into the words, to dispose you then to hear the Holy Gospel. And so the graduale and then the chant connected to the Alleluia for the same way. And the Alleluia chants go Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia just once. And then at the end, they always have what is called the jubilus or the jubilus, the jubilation. And it goes Alleluia, and it can go on for 30 seconds, just on the word ah, just on the syllable ah. Pure praise. Not trying to get through the text, not trying to be perfunctory, not going. And I'm very hyper, you can tell. But it asks us to focus on that purity of praise. And so when Pope Pius X talks about goodness of form, Those are some of the things he's talking about. Now, we've talked a lot about things, and to a certain extent there's been the hint of saying, yeah, don't do all these other things that people do in church all the time. But I want to talk about, though, who we are as people, because we're not meant to live by bread alone. How can these principles, then, that we're talking about, animate and orient the way that music accompanies us in our lives outside of Mass? Again, I talked a little bit about the idea of a Catholic sociology that rightly orders all things. And implicit in some of what I've been talking about is that we order time well. That we order time well so that we value it and we spend it like the woman who searched for the coin. So when we're thinking about good music, when we're thinking about taking some of these principles of good music into our own homes, into our lives, and I want to thank Brian Fink for encouraging me to think about and to talk about some of these things, because to me they're really valuable. What is good music? It's partly we all say, well, I know it when I hear it. It's what I like. Ooh, I'm scared to say because I don't think I know enough to say it, so I'm not going to say. Good music leads us to the good. It enlarges our understanding, makes us better people. It binds us together in the right ways, forms those bonds between people that are the ones that we truly aspire to. Remember, music functions for us physically, psychologically, socially, like language. Music lights up and uses all the same parts of our brain as language does. We like music because we like language. But of course, music does something else because it also lights up the parts of our brain that people we love light up. So music is, in a sense, like talking to the person that you're in love with. It is innate. Unless you have a specific auditory processing deficit, you have as much musical ability as almost everybody. Music, though, is also something that's cultivated. Think about language. It is both innate and natural, and we learn it we take great joy in it, and we have special ways that we talk to babies, and we know how they learn. And it's both innate, but then of course we cultivate it because we learn to write it down. We learn to become precise with it. We learn to create sentences and words and ideas. And the same exact thing happens in music. And it happens and we enjoy it for the same reason. It makes us better people for the same reason that good control and good knowledge of language makes us better people, because it allows us to explain and to think in much more complex ways. People with larger vocabularies are gifted, because mostly of circumstances of their lives, with the ability to reason in more complex ways. Not more accurate. We know people that have lots of words that say really, but more complex ways. There's more ground open to them. Music has some similar things. Music, though, remember, we need to rightly order everything. We need to put things in the correct order. And remember, we have informal ways of speaking, but we have formal ways of speaking, and we need to know about that. Think about the right ordering of married life. We know that that's a very complicated subject, but we know that the right ordering of married life is considered to be one of the central building blocks of Catholic culture. Think about food. I think I love it, clearly. You don't feed your child Cheetos all the time. They want you to, but you don't. We all don't just eat our own comfort food. Most of us even pride ourselves on trying new stuff. And so, we build more and more complex and beautiful ways of doing things. And that we still have to survive, but we do it in more beautiful ways. Think about also, in terms of music, just hold this in your head. Think about the difference between sentiment, the way that you care about something, a good way of caring about something, and sentimentality, a tawdry way of caring about something. Sentiment versus sentimentality. It's the unwritten Jane Austen book, Sentiment or Sentimentality. Few more statements. How we use our time. How we spend our time and use our God-given abilities and capacities. Is it really a moral issue, you know? We're asked, teach us to number our days. Well, part of numbering our days is to know that each number is valuable. Remember, just as with sentiment and sentimentality, our ability to love things and enjoy music, the flip side of every virtue is a vice. We can like some really horrible stuff. We have learned that we love to eat fried cheese curds. They are so good, and they'll kill you. Think about that with music. Demographically, here's another one. The same people who do the bravest things in the world, think about that. 18 to 30-year-olds, they do like the super brave stuff. They also do all the most horrible mayhem too. The flip side of our abilities. So music is a very powerful ability. It's incredibly powerful. And here's my just open pitch to you. Why not focus some of that energy on wholesome food by learning to savor wonderful food? By saying, I have no idea what that food is. I don't know what Food by Johnny food is, but I'll try some. I think all of it. You can approach music the same way. But here's the real punchline. This is when somebody reveals that they're like selling you Amway. Sing in addition to singing in church. You can't expect decent congregational singing if no one in church ever opens their mouth to sing other than in church. You just can't. Imagine that something that you did, because if you think about that singing occupies at most, 15 minutes of your time at Mass? What other complicated task could you do for 15 minutes a week, never otherwise think about, and then expect to do? I don't want to know what it is. And I don't want you to do it for me. And you think about it backwards, the other way. We know that we strive to not make our attendance at Mass the sum total of our Catholicism. The physical act of singing is profoundly powerful. It uses the biggest single muscle in our body. You're like, what is that? It's our diaphragm. It's a gigantic, big, smooth muscle that cuts all the way through the middle of us. It's huge. It's very powerful. That's why little tiny babies can wake you up from a sound sleep and make you think that the world is crashing down around you. There is a kind of music, and the music is the music of hymns, and it's devotional music, and it's meant to be sung outside of church. Every church meeting should begin with a hymn. Every group that gets together for prayer should sing a hymn. What about Tuesday nights at home? A hymn, a rosary, Another hymn. Some of the great hymns of the Catholic Church were written to be sung at home. Father Faber of the Oratory in London in the 19th century. What hymn did he write to help Catholics begin to have a sense of pride in a Protestant country, a sense of pride in who they were? Faith of Our Fathers. Yeah, he wrote it as a way for people to sing together to explain at home, or in groups, or in sodalities. Maybe even learn some of the core repertories of little simple Gregorian chants. Pater noster qui es in celis. Extraordinarily simple. I hear 300 school children sing it every single morning, Monday through Friday at Mass at my school. They love it because they know something. And the knowing, sometimes a fifth grader knows the power of that more than we as jaded adults do. Have some fun songs in your life. Some songs that are really silly and that are funny and they belong to your family, and you sing them and you laugh and you talk about them the same way you do as Dad's silly jokes. The reason I'm a musician is because my mother stayed home with me when I was a baby. But it was in the early 60s. I was born during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was no community around you. So it was just she and I in the living room. When I was 4, I knew 250 songs. Not because I'm brilliant, but because my mom was bored. And she knew a bunch of songs because she was an elementary school teacher. That was her profession. She went on to be a parochial school principal, including my parochial school principal. And that explains a lot, doesn't it? But we had songs. And my dad loved to sing. We had songs about everything. I knew all the songs that my dad's frat sang that were rude about my mother's sorority. You know, like 1950s frat songs that you sang about a fraternity. They were very cute and innocent by today's standards. But my dad would even make up songs. So we had a song about the garbage. Take my heart and take the garbage, take the mangy, dirty garbage. So singing wasn't this weird thing. Instead, it was something that just emerged out of life. And what it did is it animated life. It gave it more truth. It gave it a little extra authenticity. And really, while the things that the popes and the general instructions say about music are very definite, they call us to a high standard. They call us to a level of holiness that we will always aspire to and never fully reach here on earth. They know that we are humans who are in search of God, and they are trying to help us orient the elements of our life. I hope what I've done here is just give you some suggestions about how that orientation happens, so that instead of saying, sing this, don't sing that, sing it in this key, don't sing that on Thursdays, instead that we know why we're doing it and then what we do. Again, uniting the theological with the procedural. If we do that, we have begun to think with the mind of the church.